What you're watching is an interview that Tim Richardson, myself talking, gave to the CBC in the summer of 2008 about the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the current talks collapsing. I talked about the bilateral agreements that are going on in the wake of the talks collapsing, and I also discussed the political effects and how the country's representatives are negotiating things as a consequence of the politics. I also talked about the rural-urban disproportionate political representation, which affects how politicians vote for tariffs or subsidies. Subsidies protect the farmers, and tariffs to protect the products coming into their countries. I also talked about the effect on the world food crisis and poverty in Africa and how that's a stress. And there was also discussion on how India and China, wanting safeguards on the tariffs they have for their food supply, are both people that play in this community by being producers, but also affected by the low price of food possibilities. And now here's the original interview that I did on CBC TV.
The news that world trading powers could not reach an agreement on subsidy levels or import tariffs might not grab you, but what if I told you that the collapse of trade talks in Geneva could worsen poverty in Africa or the world food crisis? That's what some experts are saying. One of them is Tim Richardson. He's an international business professor at Seneca College and the University of Toronto. So Tim Richardson, why did these WTO talks collapse? Was there one central issue?
That would be nice if there was, because then you could fix it. But there's been a number of different issues, and the collapse is so certain that our Trade Minister Fortier said yesterday that Canada's going to go ahead and continue with its bilateral agreements. Some of the reasons why it collapsed: you've got 150 member countries, some of them big OECD countries, some of them not. Election years in several key countries. We know about the Americas with Obama. We know Canada's going to have elections soon, several others. We got a rural-urban electoral disproportionate representation thing here, which has been happening for a number of years. So if people want to get re-elected, politics is all based on individual constituencies voting. And this rural-urban electoral disproportionate thing plays out in that the farmers in the rural areas have disproportionate electoral power. That causes people who are running for elected office to be very concerned about voting for tariffs or subsidies that may disaffect these people, because then they might not get elected, especially in fractured countries where they've got multiple party systems.
So what do you think this means for the world food crisis and for poverty in Africa? Because you think that this, as a result of the collapse of these talks, it actually could get worse than it already is.
Yes, it could get worse because people in Africa and other countries could be paying more for food, and which they have little ability to do now. Let's break it down into the parts. The inputs, the seed, the fertilizer, the fuel. Of course, with fuel, we know worldwide it's been increasingly difficult. The seed, and we've got the questions about large, conglomerates, genetically modified food, and also the transportation systems. To get the fuel in the first place to different places in Africa is difficult. And we've also got people very concerned about the crop yield per acreage being very, very low. And this is why other countries that have a sustainable advantage in high technology can produce a lot of food, send it there. But then, you have to deal with tariffs and subsidies.
And China and India are being described as the deal breakers because they want safeguards to kind of protect their domestic supply. Is that a legitimate concern? It sounds like it would be a legitimate concern.
Yes.
But it's apples and oranges. You can't compare developing countries to developed countries, right?
But is China and India a developing country? I mean, you've got India's economy went over 1 trillion GDP in 2007. They're a major competitor to many European and North American economies in particular categories. Same thing in China. So the reason why China and India are such big players is not only are they consumers of large quantities, but they're also competitive producers as well.
And this, of course, Africa, I guess, gets caught in the middle of this trade war.
Indeed.
And they are the weak ones in terms of being able to really stand up and voice their concerns. So what's the situation there?
Well, you've got Ban Ki-moon saying that Africa needs $15, $20 billion worth of international food aid, which is very challenging at a time when each individual country who could participate in that is looking at their own internal domestic turmoils. They're dealing with rising fuel costs. The U.S. has got their mortgage and housing crisis and banking problems, so it's very difficult in that circumstance to have leaders to be able to deal with that problem.
But wouldn't a lot of African countries be able to actually subsist on their own food supply if it were not for the way that food from developed countries, from the United States, from Europe, interferes with that whole process?
Yes, the interference is simple. In the case of a small farmer in, say, Central African country that's got 5 acres, and he's trying to develop his food for not only himself but also to sell to some central, municipality. Why would the people in that municipality buy the food with his inputs and costs when they could get it from some international organization that provides it at a lower cost? So he ends up being somewhat disenfranchised because he's not able to compete on that level. I mean, the farmer can't just make the food just and the produce just for himself. And the principle is that he would make his own needs and then sell some, and then from that money.
But if people are getting cheaper food as a result, is that the silver lining to this in Africa?
It is, but it's also a bad thing, because then you reduce the ability to sustain your own food supply, which leads into questions of sovereignty. The sovereignty of a nation is based upon not only its economy, but it's also its food supply in times of challenging situations. And when you jeopardize that, you can have riots, you can have civil wars, and people fight over, it's a pretty serious thing.
Tim Richardson, good to speak to you. Thank you very much.